In 1493, Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean and discovered Puerto Rico during his second voyage. The Spaniards quickly conquered the area for economic and religious reasons. They were interested in the island because of its strategic geographic location. In 1508, colonization began under Juan Ponce de León. At the beginning, the Taínos held a relatively positive relationship with the Spaniards. These interactions were mainly between Agüeybaná I, a powerful Taíno chief, and Ponce de León, who became the first governor of the island. However, after Agüeybaná I's death, the relationship between the Spanish and Taínos started to deteriorate. What began as a friendly encounter between the two parties soon turned into a discordant relationship when the Taínos' way of life was threatened by the Spanish. Therefore, the Taínos took a stand against the Spanish for their survival in what is now known as the Taíno Rebellion of 1511. Brutality, violence, and oppression forced the natives to stand up against the Spanish. With the arrival of the Europeans to the Americas, an intense ideological debate began about whether to incorporate, expel, or destroy the inhabitants of the territories that came under the control of the Spanish Empire. Queen Isabella issued the Royal Decree of 1503, justifying the subjugation and enslavement of the native population. It authorized war on them if they refused to convert to Christianity. The Spaniards forced the Taínos into an encomienda system, while pressuring the conversion of Christianity upon them. Under this system, the encomenderos were responsible for a group of natives. They were evangelized and forced to do work labor in the gold mines. They were constantly exposed to disease and infections. The Spaniards would kill any Taíno if they became old, weak, disobedient, or simply if they desired to. Because the Spanish considered the Taíno inferior, they were labeled as property and had no rights, so the Spaniards felt entitled to do what they pleased. As early as 1511, Fray Antonio de Montesinos argued against the inhumane treatment against the Taínos. Another one of the most famous critics of this system was Friar Bartolomé de las Casas. Friar Bartolomé de las Casas was a 16th century Spanish historian, social reformer, and Dominican friar. He became the first resident bishop of Chiapas, and the first officially appointed protector of the Indians.
What we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind.
Because of individuals such as de las Casas, the Burgos Laws of 1512 were created to limit the abuses of the indigenous population by the Spaniards in the Americas. The laws required fair treatment, such as fair pay, work, and religious training. Although these laws were created to halt the abuse of the Taínos, they were not enforced throughout the Americas, due to the fact that the colonists did not find them beneficial to their goals. The Taínos' way of life took a drastic turn under Spanish rule. Tribes and families were torn apart. Women were raped, men and children killed, and villages destroyed. The Taínos did not consent to evangelization and cultural genocide. Many of them lost their will and desire to live. As a result, indigenous people were left with the option of either giving up their cultural identity or facing death. Many indigenous people choose the last one when they committed suicide. Even mothers killed their children because they did not want them to live under slavery. Spanish conversion efforts were detrimental to the population. Despite their efforts, very few Taínos converted, while others resisted completely.
Muchas naciones hispanoamericanas, donde los indígenas todavía hoy siguen siendo explotados, marginados y silenciados. Hay otras, como en Puerto Rico, la gente vive enajenada, como fue hace 500 años, y no quedan taínos, pues no nos afecta.
In order to escape their harsh reality, many Taínos fled to the mountains of Puerto Rico. There, with their new leader, Agüeybaná II, or El Bravo, to guide them, the Taínos were ready to begin their defiant stance against the Spaniards. The Taínos resisted Spanish oppression, and their actions against them demonstrated that they were not going to stand passively. The Spaniards had technologies far more advanced, such as lances, swords, crossbow, and harquebus, an early type of musket. On the other hand, the natives' weapons were no match for the Spanish, but they were ready to fight. They were experts with the bow and arrow, and had extensive knowledge of the geography of Puerto Rico. This gave them an edge when carrying ambushes on their opponent. They would use canoes to move by water and go into remote, inaccessible areas in the mountains, where they knew that the Spanish could not get into. Taínos had the help of the Caribes, an indigenous people from the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean, with a much more warlike mindset. Initially, they posed a threat to the Taino, but joined forces when both tribes realized that the threat the Spanish posed on their establishment was greater. Most Taino chiefs, also known as caciques, joined efforts to fight the Spanish as one. They convinced the villagers that the Spanish were not gods like they initially thought, which motivated them to fight. The Taínos began to non-stop attacks with guerrilla strategies for the next 8 years. Guerrilla warfare includes ambushes, sabotage, and raids to fight a larger and less mobile traditional military. Caciques united their villages to fight against the Spanish's harsh treatment of the Taino people. The rebellion began in 1511 when the Taínos killed Sotomayor, a high-ranking Spanish officer. In this attack, Spanish forces and villages were destroyed in a Taino attempt to force the Spanish into retreat. At the time of the rebellion, it is estimated that hundreds of Spanish fought against a force of thousands of Taínos. Even though the Spanish population was smaller than the Taínos, the Spanish had better weapons, which the Taínos did not have. This hindered the Taino from fighting for their land and safety. Regardless, Taínos had a successful attack in the month of June in 1513 where hundreds attacked Caparra, which was the headquarters of colonial government at the time. They killed and wounded various people and burned down the town church. Additionally, the Taino destroyed almost all the houses in the village. After the battle, Ponce de León sent all his men to fight the Taínos. The Taínos suffered defeat, and the rebellion is recorded to have ended here around 1518, even though sporadic attacks continued until 1529. Shortly after the battle, the Taínos were, once and for all, put under the encomienda system and slavery. Prisoners were sold to neighbors as slaves. Unfortunately, the Taínos would suffer these conditions for years to come. The defeat of the Taínos had devastating consequences on the short and long term for the indigenous people. Despite their efforts to fight the Spanish, they were ultimately unsuccessful in their conquest to regain their lands. Therefore, they were forced to cede their fighting positions. The Taino chiefs had to recognize the authority of the king if they wanted to be forgiven. Only 2 Taino chiefs gave in, demonstrating that the pride of the Taínos was more important than surrendering to the enemy. Ultimately, the Taínos lost all their power to the Spaniards, and their way of life forever changed. Families were torn apart, villages destroyed, diseases such as smallpox decimated the population, and the Taino became a symbol of a lost past.
Gran debate cuando se acerca el 12 de octubre, ¿verdad? Entre los mexicanos y los españoles, de que si eso fue genocidio, que si ustedes nos deben, que si reparaciones, que si esto. Yo siempre he creído que lo que hicieron los españoles en el mundo, así hayan pasado 500 años, fue un genocidio.
The outcome of the Taino rebellion had a long-lasting effect. The Taínos' defeat contributed to their demise, but their cultural heritage still influences Puerto Rican cultures today. Due to the vast intermingling of races, the Taino blood remained in the people of Puerto Rico, resulting in a unique blend of Spanish, African American, and Taino individuals. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited strictly maternally, remains in modern-day Puerto Rican people's genetics. According to studies, the average Puerto Rican has 12% Native American DNA in their blood, which is a direct correlation to their terminated ancestors. Taino cultural elements were adapted by the Spanish, as well as techniques to make huts and hammocks. Names given to towns, musical instruments, and words in our vocabulary remain in circulation in Puerto Rican language. In addition to this, a small minority of pro-independence movement followers from Spanish to modern times have been inspired by Agüeybaná II, the Brave, and have urged the people to liberate from foreign control. Therefore, his bravery has been a topic of inspiration for writers who have supported the pro-independence movement since the 19th century. Regardless of their defeat and decimation, Puerto Ricans feel proud of the Taínos' bravery and influence in their culture and traditions. The Taino people, although eradicated, will forever live on in the blood and cultural consciousness of the Puerto Rican people today.